Post-apocalyptic strategy games fall into two groups: those that treat a collapse as a mood, and the ones that make it the structure everything else depends on. The first group looks the part but plays like any other strategy game. The second group builds tension through scarcity, pressure, and a constant sense that your decisions are digging you out of one hole by opening another. Hello and welcome to another amazing Top 5 video brought to you by the team at Critical Moves. We are so happy to have you. First and foremost is Project Zomboid. This is a bit of an unusual pick because of its long-standing early access time, but boy is it a gem. Project Zomboid treats the apocalypse as a long, slow grind, as evidenced by the aforementioned long early access period. Most zombie strategy titles frame survival around neat waves or familiar RTS patterns, but Zomboid does it even better. It commits to a world that doesn't care what you're doing. The danger comes from the steady erosion of food, tools, shelter, and your own confidence. In this game, you can literally run away from everything and hide in the woods and fish until you die. The danger comes from all of those systems working together. It is a simulation that is also a strategy game, and it builds from the tension that comes from trying to do those ordinary tasks. Breaking a window, cooking a meal, or clearing a room becomes a negotiation with risk and reward, because at any time the world could shift underneath you. Electricity fails, water fails, supplies run out. The zombie population keeps moving towards sounds. It's not dramatic, it's all in the background. You might not even know it's happening. The game trusts that you'll understand that. The approach carries through the entire experience. You plan each movement because the map doesn't reset. Okay? The consequences linger. In fact, if you respawn in the same map, you might see your dead body running around as a zombie. And that'll linger for long after the danger's passed. The world feels indifferent instead of theatrical. You're not the star of this story. You're just another cog. That gives this apocalypse a steady pressure that few of these strategy games can manage. The structure works because the systems stay consistent even as your situation deteriorates. Skills improve slowly enough that you make progress, but it feels earned. You push through a routine that becomes more unstable with each passing day. Your tools break, your vehicles run out of fuel, injuries pile up until the character is tired and the player is stressed. That fatigue and stress is the point. Zomboid shows how collapse works when nothing suddenly shifts and the decline comes from a series of small failures. Unless you get really good and make it a long time, then there's a shift. Oh, is there a shift? But the interface is still a little rough. Even though it's been in long development, it still has a learning curve, not a great tutorial. You've really got to commit to this, okay? Death can come abruptly. The game doesn't soften the blow with narrative or checkpoints or anything like that. You die, you're done. Zomboid refuses to smooth it down. It presents a world that keeps grinding forward and grinding you down whether you're ready or not. Treats the apocalypse as an environment you adapt to rather than a set of scripted scenarios you clear. The next game we're going to talk about is Infection Free Zone. This game brings the apocalypse down to a very unique scale that most strategy games ignore. In this game, you are going to focus on handful of blocks in a city you probably recognize. It might even be your own. It uses streets, intersections, and buildings that are real locations pulled from actual map data. This makes the game way more realistic, immersive, and anchored in a way that a lot of zombie games or strategy titles cannot achieve. You can see exactly why a route is dangerous. You know the bottlenecks because you've lived them. And you can picture how your neighborhood can become defensible through placement rather than by design. You have to make it work. The early structure builds tension through scarcity and a daily cycle of scavenging and reinforcement. Nights hit harder than usual tower defense routines because you're dealing with fragile supply lines and limited manpower instead of kill zones. The game wants you to extend your reach slowly, not because the map tells you to, but because your people can't handle a wide perimeter without overstretching. This keeps the pacing grounded and stops the game from drifting into the standard expand until you win mentality that usually shapes colony sims. The systems aren't polished at all. Pathfinding can break your rhythm. Resource flow occasionally freezes progression, and the AI doesn't always react in a way that feels real, especially for the layout of city. Okay? Even with those issues, it's got some serious tension because the structure is built around the idea of fragile survival maintained by small gains and careful routes. The sense of scale keeps the experience focused, and the simplicity of the structure serves the theme better than a larger, more complex model would. Infection-Free Zone commits to showing collapse without inflating it. The game focuses on immediate problems, limited reach, and spaces that feel lived in before they fall apart. The design shows what happens when society shrinks down to a few streets and you're responsible for keeping your own little patch, your own little kingdom, alive. Our third game is Terminator Dark Fate Defiance. This game builds its structure around a future where machines dominate the planet. Civilian groups are fractured and armed factions cling to what little is left. The campaign pushes you across ruined territory while making logistics, attrition, and battlefield position the center of decision making. The setting drives the structure of the missions and the arc of the campaign, which is more than most licensed Terminator games have managed in the last 2 decades. The framework provides pressure because units carry damage across scenarios. Resources stay scarce, and the game expects you to make decisions based on long-term stability instead of short-term spikes. The campaign shows you how a resistance group stays operational inside a world that's fundamentally hostile. You feel the cost of every mistake because a bad engagement lingers. The narrative doesn't have to overstate the stakes when the mechanics deliver them directly. Defiance succeeds by letting the missions reflect the shifting situation rather than focusing everything through standard RTS templates. Retreats, escorts, urban fights, and improvised defenses all sit inside a structure that feels reactive to the state of the conflict. The pacing stays tight because the game doesn't inflate scenarios for spectacle. It keeps them tied to the practical goals of survival and movement. The weaknesses show up in the repetition of certain objectives in mission setups that occasionally depend too much on trial and error. Some encounters push the player into narrow solutions, and the narrative pushes too hard in a few places. The campaign earns this spot because it's one of the few licensed strategy games that uses the fiction as a framework instead of just decoration and set pieces. The world shapes the missions, and the missions reinforce the collapse, which gives Defiance more coherence than most RTS campaigns attempting similar ideas. Our fourth game is They Are Billions. This game reduces the apocalypse to a single problem: pressure. Build too slowly and you fall behind. Build too quickly and you expose weaknesses that collapse everything. The game's identity comes from how it forces you to balance expansion against defense without ever giving you the comfort of stabilizing fully. That tension drives more thematic work than most narrative-driven titles because you feel the stakes through your layout, not through cutscenes. The structure is simple but disciplined. Each map pushes you outward with limited resources and dangerous terrain. Every decision becomes a permanent part of the defense you'll rely on when the wave arrives. The game avoids the trap of offering a dozen partially meaningful choices. Instead, it gives you a handful of decisions that shape the entire run, and that restraint keeps the pressure constant. When a wall fails, the whole settlement becomes a single failure chain, and that fragility defines the experience more clearly than any scripted event. The campaign lacks the strength of the survival mode, but even there, the scenarios maintain the core idea of incremental expansion under threat. The story is light, which helps more than it hurts, because it avoids distracting from the tension cycle at the heart of the game. They Are Billions works because it presents the apocalypse through scarcity and pressure rather than narrative. The weaknesses come from repetition and a difficulty curve that can feel engineered to punish experimentation. Once you understand the game's rhythm, some maps telegraph their demands too clearly, and the late waves push the mechanics to their edge. Still, the structure stays sound and the tension never dissolves. Okay, last but certainly not least is Frostpunk. The notorious Frostpunk treats survival, control, and sacrifice as the spine of the entire experience. The cold is a permanent antagonist that never loosens its grip, and the city you build is shaped entirely by how you choose to absorb said pressure. The game doesn't rely on exposition to explain the state of the world. The systems tell you everything you need to know through heat management, workplace conditions, and the constant struggle to keep your people alive long enough to maintain the generator. The law system gives Frostpunk a structural identity that few strategy games attempt. Each decision carries a social cost that reshapes how your population functions, and those shifts feed back into production, morale, and conflict. You hold a fragile society together through a series of compromises that feel necessary in the moment and uncomfortable once you've enacted them. That discomfort is part of the design, and it gives the campaign a tone that never softens. It just builds. The missions and scenarios keep that tension by forcing you into situations where the weather, the population, and the map are all pushing against you. Frostpunk doesn't escalate through bigger armies or resource surpluses. It escalates through tighter deadlines, colder temperatures, strained infrastructure, and populations that react to your decisions with increasing intensity. The pressure is constant, but it never feels artificial because the systems reinforce each other cleanly. The game has flaws, of course. The optimal paths can feel rigid once you understand them, and some scenarios lean too heavily on specific builds. But the overall structure stays coherent because everything flows from the same idea: survival at any cost. Frostpunk 2 didn't make our list because the original's better. It delivers the concept without stretching beyond what the systems can support. And that focus gives it a clarity the sequel just doesn't match. Frostpunk treats the apocalypse as the framework, not the backdrop, and it never loses that focus. These games show how post-apocalyptic strategy design works when the theme is integrated into the mechanics. Each one turns the collapse into a structural condition that shapes pacing, decisions, and the level of pressure you operate under. Some pieces are rough, some systems feel stretched, but the core idea stays intact across all of them. The world is broken, and every decision you make is about holding the line long enough to keep moving. When the theme shapes the structure instead of decorating it, you get games worth remembering. Thanks for listening, everybody. Critical Moves, out.